Hello, everyone. So, in this podcast episode, we are going to be discussing Dr. Seuss and racism and looking specifically at anti Japanese sentiments during World War II. First, we're going to take a look at the modern view of internment camps and anti Japanese sentiments. And if you can see, this image right here comes from the Japanese American Memorial to Patriotism during World War II. First, just to provide some context, September 1st, 1939, World War II was started, and at this point, anti Japanese sentiments weren't necessarily as big as they were following the events of December 7th, 1941, which was when Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese Imperial Army. And Pearl Harbor was a U.S. naval base in Hawaii, and so this kind of created the anti Japanese sentiments that were shared by a lot of white Americans during this time. On December 10th, 1941, Dr. Seuss's Alley Cats is published, and then in February 13th, 1942, Dr. Seuss's Signal from Home is published, and these are both political cartoons. And February 19th, 1942, Executive Order 9066 is issued by President FDR, and this was issued to all persons of Japanese ancestry and forced them to live in internment camps. And on February 20th, 1942, Dr. Seuss's political cartoon One Hand Tied is published. September 2nd, 1945, World War II ended. However, the last internment camp was officially closed in March 1946. So the first reading we'll look at is the history of Japanese racism, Japanese American red dress, and the dangers associated with government regulation of hate speech. So as you can tell from this title and this quote on Japanese internment, the authors believe that Japanese internment was not necessary, it was embarrassing, and that government regulation of hate speech is dangerous and can often escalate situations in very negative ways, like it did with the internment camps. The next article we'll be looking at is titled Justice Deferred, a 50-Year Perspective on Japanese Internment Historiography. And so, a quote from this article that I really like is Japanese internment represents the failure of a government to control its citizens, to curb their passions, moderate their instincts, and calm their fears. And as you can see from this quote, this author took 50 years and looked back and believes that Japanese internment was not necessary, it was embarrassing, it was just made worse by the US government, and it all really could have been avoided. And from modern day, this is a statement released by President Biden on the Day of Remembrance of Japanese American Internment, so February 19th, 2021. And in it, he says, America failed to live up to our founding ideals of liberty and justice. And he also reaffirmed the federal government's formal apology to Japanese Americans. This apology just shows that even today, the presidents are still apologizing for what happened as a result of Executive Order 9066. Other important presidential mentions are President Ford. He signed a proclamation that formally terminated Executive Order 9066, as well as offered a formal apology in 1976. President Carter created the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, and this examined policies and was a study, and it concluded that internment camps were not justified, and this was found in 1980. And President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, and this compensated over 100,000 people of Japanese descent, and it again offered a formal apology, and this was in 1988. Now we're going to talk about Dr. Seuss. He's no stranger to political cartoons, as you can see by this political cartoon. So who was Dr. Seuss? Dr. Seuss's real name is Theodore Seuss Geisel. He was born on March 2nd, 1904, and he is most notably a children's book author. He's written things like The Cat in the Hat, Green Eggs and Ham, Horton Hears a Who, so he's very well known for that, but he has also published multiple political cartoons, as we are about to see. Real quick, to define a political cartoon, I really like this definition from Encyclopedia Britannica, which states a drawing made for the purpose of conveying editorial commentary on politics, politicians, and current events. As you can see in this political cartoon created by Dr. Seuss, Hitler is seen as almost a caricature and very cartoony. So the first one we're going to be looking at is from December 10th, 1941, and this took place 3 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese Imperial Army. And as you can see, it says, maybe only alley cats, but jeepers, a hell of a lot of them. You can see this sign here says Jap alley, which is a derogatory term used to refer to Japanese people. And you can see they are coming in a huge mass. And even though it kind of shows that maybe only alley cats, kind of derogatory, they're not as brave or as strong as the US, especially as you can see this Father Sam figure representing the US sort of towers over them and is so much bigger than all of them. But you can see, especially in the phrase, a hell of a lot of them, there are so many, they're launching themselves over into the US, they're taking over the US, empowering the US in the eyes of Dr. Seuss. You can see these Japanese people are just going over the US in order to gain control, acknowledgments. And from this political cartoon from February 13th, 1942, this was following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but this was before Executive Order 9066, and it says waiting from the signal from home. So you can see all these caricatures, these racist depictions of Japanese people picking up TNT, and they're going in Washington, Oregon, California, and they're waiting from the signal from the Japanese to take the US down from the inside, according to this cartoon. And these locations are very relevant because, as you can see, Japan is here, and when people immigrated to the US, they came in this West Coast area, so California, Oregon, Washington. And in this political cartoon from February 20th, 1942, a day after Executive Order 9066 was signed, you see this US figure saying, shucks, we can whip the Japs with one hand tied behind us. So, as you can see by the sash, he's conceited. He is cocky. This is 1941, before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. However, in 1942, following the bombing of Pearl Harbor and Executive Order 9066, they say, hey, I said one hand, not both. You can see their hands are literally tied, and they're wearing sashes that say incompetence and carelessness, showing that Dr. Seuss believed the US government dropped the ball on dealing with the Japanese before Pearl Harbor, and that Dr. Seuss believes that this is a drastic measure and that the US is flawed, and this is a very negative depiction of the US, saying they were cocky. And it just kind of shows that the overwhelming masses of Japanese people, as seen in both of these cartoons, very much took a toll on the US. And also, really quickly, just wanted to mention that Dr. Seuss has also not only racist images and depictions like these and these in his political cartoons, in some of his children's books, there are also these racist depictions, and about 6 of his books are going to be pulled from shelves due to these depictions. So, going back to modern day, most people look back on his really racist works with disdain, and they want to hide them. And now, going back to attitudes of the past and why this was okay and why this was okay, we're going to talk a little bit about what was the context more so. So, as previously mentioned, Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th, 1941, bombing of a US naval base. And even though this was done by the Japanese Imperial Army, Japanese Americans took a lot of the hit from this. In Pearl Harbor, there was 2,403 US personnel killed, and this includes a low number of civilians, but this was the overall number killed in Pearl Harbor. As a result of Pearl Harbor, Executive Order 9066 was signed. This created the internment camps, and this is where anybody, even people who were full-on American citizens of Japanese descent, were forced to go. There was a fear that they had loyalty and allegiance to Japan, even though they were American citizens. So out of fear for the US and fear for themselves, the government kept these people in internment camps to not keep them safe from the hatred they were experiencing, but instead to keep the mainly white US citizens safe from people of Japanese descent. And 120,000 Japanese Americans were held in internment camps. And as you can see from these photos, young children had to go, everybody had to go. If you were even Japanese descent, people were not It was not by if you had US citizenship, it was by what you looked like and where you were from. Even if you had never lived in Japan, if you were Japanese, you were forced to go into these internment camps. And oftentimes these people would be forced to abandon their houses, their jobs, their own businesses. They had to abandon their whole livelihood and pack everything they ever cared and loved into small little suitcases, and that was all they could take with them. And as you can see here on this sign that says, I am an American, even people who were full on American were forced to go into these camps. And real quick, before we wrap up, I just want to talk a little bit about how these attitudes have not gone away. Here you can see 3 young boys in a Japanese internment camp, and here you can see these young children in one of the camps designed to contain migrants from the southern border, or the border of US and Mexico. And these are very similar. They're both fenced in. Current US immigration policies, even though these boys were probably born in America or American citizens, similar policies are designed to protect, air quotes around, protect the rest of the US from these migrants. And also you can see President Roosevelt signing into order Executive Order 9066, and here's Donald Trump signing what is often dubbed the Muslim ban, which reduces travel and immigration from countries that have Islam as their main religion. So you can kind of see that even though these attitudes are from over 70, 80 years ago, we can still see similar attitudes in modern history today. And so, just to conclude, here are all the references I've used in constructing this podcast. Feel free to check them out, and thank you so much for listening.